Once again, the battle has been won. My name is Adam Traczyk. I'm the co-founder of Foundation. We've got the honor to be one of the partners of today's World in Focus. The Global.Lab Foundation deals with international politics from a progressive perspective. We are trying to look at international politics with a fresh eye, from a different perspective, and that's why we decided to suggest to the Heinrich Böll Foundation to meet and talk about progressive foreign politics. It's also important for all the Greens, and we would like to talk about feminist issues today, as these issues are of utmost importance to the Greens. We've got a lot of competition of superpowers in today's world, so let's now focus on something totally different. And I have the honor to welcome you to this panel. Sorry, I've got a cold. And we are going to... I'm going to introduce our guest, Agnieszka Lichnerowicz, Talk FM. A journalist, expert on international affairs, and the director of international department of the radio. She is also the host of the Światopogląd program. Stefan Gullgren from Swedish Embassy. Sweden is one of the founders of feminist, progressive foreign policy. We are really glad to host you today. And last but not least, Agnieszka Gotkowska, Eastern Studies Center specialist on security, who focuses on Nordic states and on Germany. Without further ado, I'd like to address my first question to Agnieszka. What is a feminist foreign policy? Is it really an approach which offers a real alternative to what we can observe in today's world, or is it something fashionable, a catchy buzzword, which is obviously controversial in Poland, because in Poland this horrible word starting with F evokes lots of controversy, but that's not only in Poland. And what is this foreign feminist policy? Well, I think that both of the things you said are true. I'm a journalist, so I'm not capable of scientific analysis. So let me just perform a journalistic synthesis. And I'd like to say that what we would like to offer is a feminist perspective. In practice and theory of international relations, it has been present for several decades now, and it's trying to gain more and more followers. But it should also be stressed that this concept and perspectives it offers are becoming more and more important, and depending on the point of view, depending on the theoretical and practical perspective, it might have different dimensions. But at the very basic level, we have this ethical and practical dimension, which relies in the fact that the absence of women in decision-making processes and different kinds of international actions is inappropriate from the social point of view, and is a manifestation of discrimination for women who, due to systemic reasons, are thrown out of decision-making groups. And it is impractical and practical as well, because not taking into account the gender perspective of women, the experience of women, when taking various kinds of decisions, leads to a situation where the decisions are faulty and short-sighted. And the two most common dimensions where the feminist perspective can be observed and there is lots of research, although in its infancy still, when it comes to peaceful negotiations, because in terms of peaceful negotiations, there are lots of initiatives also in UN. The ambassador will probably talk about it later on. The absence of women at negotiation tables means that it is harder to reach a conclusion, and if a conclusion is reached, then statistically it lasts for a shorter time, because what's lacking at the negotiation table is the perspective that is felt by women mostly when it comes to education, infrastructure, and in general, the situation in a country where a peaceful process should take place, because so the lack of women means the decisions are either not taken or short-sighted. And another dimension, it is of a functional nature, and it functions in politics of many countries, and it regards developmental policy. And from experience, we know that investing by microloans or supporting women in different kinds of ways under smaller or bigger developmental projects has lots of consequences due to gender nature. And I would like to stress the word gender here. What I mean here is the experience, the perspective of women in a given society. Without women, GDP grows slower. And now, the ambassador will probably talk about this more, because Sweden is a country which officially declares its policies, international policy is feminist as well. And this manifests itself in a number of things, and the gender criterion should be taken into account when taking any decision. This is a criterion that is taken into account when taking decisions on a given contract, on a given body. There should be representation of women, and the perspective of women should be included. And it both regards discrimination and the practical dimension. And now we get into what's really interesting, and I would call this area ideological area, because the gender perspective very often means the structure of a change to the structure of power, a change to the social structure, because the current social structure discriminates against women, excludes women from lots of structures, and is based on philosophical assumptions that say that women should be absent. So when women are included in those structures, they are starting to change the entire structure of power, priorities of power. And when it comes to Sweden, well, I leave these issues to the ambassador and the other panelists. But of course, this evokes controversy. How can we defend ourselves from Russia, which is a real threat and has nuclear bomb? And obviously the perspective of those who are supporters of feminist foreign policy, well, they claim it is a policy which will not solve all the problems right now. It is rather about investing in some long-term solutions. It is about building a world where in the future the threat from Russia will not exist. So it's not about changing the world right now immediately. Well, if there are people who claim so, well, I will not convince you to that this will change tomorrow. That's impossible. And Woodrow Wilson, Carter, Olaf Palme, this is the perspective represented by them, a perspective of tackling imperialism, investing in soft skills, in negotiations, in peaceful processes. But other people claim that feminist foreign policy is something that believes that dialogue, cooperation, justice, also in international relations, are of utmost importance. So we need solidarity that reaches over border, and we understand this as a global project that will ensure us peace in the future. So we might say that this is a brand which is being created by Sweden and a range of other countries. It is a kind of a marketing product that sells well today. but we might argue whether this is good to use this word starting with F, or whether this brings negative results. And the very last thing I would like to say, the left-wing or progressive approach to feminist foreign policy is this overall picture of this policy, the overall approach to this policy. And there are people who would claim that how is it possible for Sweden to have a feminist foreign policy if it sells munition? How is it possible for Canada to claim it has a foreign feminist policy when it signs agreements such as NAFTA? So the most progressive, the most comprehensive ideological approach of foreign feminist policy assumes it's very similar to the New Green Deal assumptions. The fight for climate, and in this case, fight for women's rights, is a mechanism to change the world, to make it a better place, a more just place. And then it needs to encompass trade policies, issues such as munition trade, and we should take those criteria into account. And there are certain things which are utopian right now, but it's like with democracy, it's just a concept. And according to me, it is really inspiring for me today, not from a fundamentalist perspective, which would like to list down all the features and implement them one after another. But for me, it's a new concept which is opposite to some older concepts. We might assume that we are in a transition period between an older system and a newer one, and what we have is unilateralism and manifestation of power. Saudi Arabia, Putin and Trump. And feminist foreign policy shows that in the long run, cooperation, equality of men and women is more pragmatic than all those more barbaric concepts of geopolitics, unilateral geopolitics. And the Minister of Sweden, Minister of Canada, well, they are the only ones. Well, it's very striking if countries such as Saudi Arabia murder journalists today, and still the world is cooperating with them as it used to. In the future, in the past, I think that ethics are disappearing from international relations. But this concept claims that in the long run, ethics does make sense and brings good results.
In other words, Elizabeth Watch, in her article, which was translated into Polish and published in the newspaper Wysoki Obczasy, she said that feminism is a good solution for everything, and she was referring to feminist foreign policy. So now we have the following question: what does this feminist foreign policy look like in practical terms? The Swedish Foreign Office published a handbook about what this feminist foreign policy should be like, what it should look like. So, Mr. Ambassador, could you please explain how can this be implemented into practice?
Thank you. Yes, I will try to do that. But before I go into the practical aspects of the feminist foreign policy, maybe, if you allow me, I will say a few words as a comment to what you said, because I think you put the whole concept very clearly, and the discussion about what is a feminist foreign policy very clearly. But to me, and I would argue to the Swedish government, which happens to be a government of Social Democrats and the Green Party, but I don't think this is a matter of left or right. If you read into the feminist foreign policy concept, ideological positions, for example, on arms exports or whatever, I think you miss the point, because the point is not left or right. The point is that we are in the world's population about half women and half men. And there is no defendable reason why one half of the world's population should not have the same rights and influence as the other half. And people are different. Women are different, men are different. We have different political convictions. We have different expectations of life. We have different positions when we vote, and so on. And if you define feminist foreign policy or feminist policy as such as left, then you miss the point. And I think that this is also one of the reasons why some people feel very challenged by the concept, because they think it is about other things than it really is. It is about rights, the fact that women have the same rights as men. It's about representation, that they should have representation in political bodies or in other organizations of influence, could also be the private business. Representation equal to the representation of men. And it's also about resources, the fact that we should spend money not only on areas which are of importance to men, but also of areas which are important to women. And those 3 R's were the cornerstones of the feminist foreign policy when it was launched in 2014 by the Swedish government, articulated by our then Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, who is really the person who has defined the Swedish version of feminist foreign policy, and also the mother, if I may say so, of the Swedish foreign policy. And if you want to know the details, there is a handbook. You can download it on our website. It's 100 pages. I'm not going to go through all of it. But I think that this makes the Swedish, or the concept of feminist foreign policy less controversial if you really understand what it means and what it tries to achieve. Now, that does not make it not controversial at all, because obviously if you have half of the population of the world, broadly speaking, with influence, and you are saying that the other half should have as much influence as you have, many will be very challenged by that, because it means that some people will have to lose influence. And you can just break it down in my own organization, the Swedish Foreign Service. We have now attained about half of all ambassadors, all heads of missions are women. And about half of all our heads of department in the ministry in Stockholm are women. Of course, earlier the proportion was 60-40. That means that some men who probably hoped for promotion, they did not get that promotion because women got the promotions instead. And those individuals probably feel to some extent discriminated against. So maybe that they thought that why can't I have the promotion, but why do I have to take a step back because women should have these positions instead? And this is in a very small context. You can widen that context to a society, a country, or even the global society. And of course there will be controversies. But on the other hand, any change will lead to controversies. The question is if you think that the goal of that change is more important than the controversies, then I think it needs to be done anyway. And that's also what we are trying to do. Now, how do we do it? What's the practical implementation of a feminist foreign policy? Well, again, if you take the 3 R's, rights, that means that we are talking about this all the time in any forum which is relevant, and those are most forums. We used our time as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council to push through mentioning or references to the rights of women in any decision, any resolution adopted by the UN Security Council. And we were quite successful. And you have, of course, the resolution 1325, which is also mentioned in the invitation to this seminar. There are 7 other resolutions which form the basis of women's rights as far as the UN Security Councils are concerned. But then, of course, the Council adopts other decisions and resolutions, and it's important to us. We thought it was important that the rights of women were mentioned, were referenced to, and formed a core of any decision taken by this body. And we have been trying to work in the same fashion in any other fora where we are represented. For example, in the European Union, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and so on. Does this make a difference? Well, maybe not immediately, but it will step by step have an impact, because it means that it's going to be forming the core of the work of these organizations, and we are shaping norms that will then be at the basis of of policies for the future. Now, the second R, representation. That can be anything from small things, like, for example, how do we set up a panel if we organize a seminar where it can't only be men? I think we have a good representation on this panel, but that is not always the case. And if you think about it, how many discussions have you seen where there have only been men in the panel? Maybe you haven't reflected on it, but it actually does make a difference if you have a mixed panel. The same goes for the appointments of representatives to various boards, the appointments in our case, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have a female foreign minister. The number 2 person, number 3 person are both women. I would argue that probably is a result of the feminist foreign policy. The government as such is also 50-50 women and men. It would not be possible, I would say, to have any other representation in the Swedish government nowadays. It's not because of the Swedish foreign policy or the feminist foreign policy, but that's the way that Sweden works. But it also has an impact when we meet with representatives of other countries, that we are well represented, men and women. And thirdly, when it comes to resources, we are spending quite a lot of money in various international organizations, especially the ones which are part of the UN family. We are one of the biggest spenders when it comes to international development aid and also international development money. And of course, money talks. If we require that these organizations shape policies which reflect the fact that women should have the same rights and influence as men, and we are not prepared to pay money unless they do, well, of course, that's going to have an impact. I would argue that it does have an impact. Not immediately, but it will have an impact. We are able to fund lots of projects that would otherwise not be funded, not only directly by us, but through the organizations to which we contribute with our funding. And this does have an impact. The fact that we have this seminar is a result, I think, of the fact that there is a debate about feminist foreign policy or feminism as such, which is not only, of course, because of what we have done in Sweden, but I don't think it's a trend. It's a natural result of, as I said initially, the simple fact that half of the world's population are women, and you cannot, I would argue, say that should be reasons why this half of the population should not have the same rights and influence as men. That's what it comes down to.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Much and a short remark. Well, the second R you were referring to, representation, that women might be underrepresented in foreign policy. Heinrich Böll Foundation was working together with the Institute of Public Affairs. It related to Poland. You can download it at our website. Agnieszka was working on this report, so you can see whether women are represented enough in Poland, or maybe they are underrepresented. So we can learn about this if you read this report. And I would like to ask Justyna Gotkowska the following question. Someone called feminist foreign policy a fab, and I remember reading this article. So this Swedish minister, she's no longer present in public life now. She's taking care of her children and her grandchildren, but the ambassador was saying that she's the mother of this concept of feminist foreign policy. So this was described as a fanaberia of that Swedish minister in this article, and the Ministry of Defense is responsible for this hard security issues, not soft security issues. So what would be your opinion about this practical implementation? Is this really just about marketing, or maybe this is something that has positive or negative results which are tangible?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this panel. And if I understand it correctly, I should present the perspective of a critic of feminist foreign policy here. I will try to fulfill this role, but I'll try to present you with my analysis of the Swedish feminist foreign policy. And I'd like to emphasize that I do not deal with the foreign female feminist policy per se. I was dealing very intensely with the military cooperation of Nordic states, and in 2014, when democratic green government came to power in Sweden, and Margot Wallström became foreign minister, I was wondering, and I was a bit scared and worried, that the priorities of female foreign policy will influence the foreign policy of Sweden, which after 2010, but particularly after 2014, started to change significantly. Sweden was no longer a state which was deeply involved in foreign missions of civil and military intervention in Middle East, in Afghanistan. It changed its defense policy towards its region. It was strengthening its capabilities to defend its own country. And the question was pretty natural, how the priorities of feminist foreign policy will influence the current course of Swedish policy. And that's what I would like to discuss today. For this reason, I've been looking very closely at the developments in the feminist foreign policy, and I was trying to put this policy in the broader context of Swedish foreign policy. And let me also say a couple of words about what Agnieszka Lichnerowicz mentioned, which is a certain brand, because I think that in Sweden, feminist foreign policy is a certain brand. Starting from 1970s, Sweden took part in international relations as superpowers when it comes to humanitarian issues. There is a great book by Kobolevich which is entitled Moralist, and it is devoted to Sweden and moral aspects of its policy. I think that Sweden aspires to be this moral role model when it comes to international relations, but there are lots of issues related to this problem, and they are described in this book, and they give a totally different picture of Sweden, a picture that is not unrealistically positive. So the brand was supposed to strengthen the Sweden's humanitarian nature and moralistic nature, and it was also supposed to be addressed at social democratic voters, both when it comes to voters and when it comes to parties themselves. But getting back to what foreign feminist policy is from my perspective, I think it's one of the core elements of Swedish foreign policy, but it is not an entire, an overall concept which is followed by Sweden in its international policy. And as a component of the overall Swedish policy, I think it is one of crucial components which is useful to combat violence against women, to strengthen the role of women in public life, in economic life, and also in private life. And this policy is addressed at developing countries. It is being implemented by developmental aid, humanitarian aid schemes. It is also included in civil and military activities. And I totally agree with such a concept, and I think it should be promoted. And Sweden has been promoting this concept, as Mr. Ambassador said, mostly in international organizations, UN, also when it comes to external activities taken by the European Union. And to a lesser extent, I think this concept is influencing the policy of Sweden when it comes to its relations with NATO. And also, to a lesser extent, it influences the relations with the superpowers such as United States, Russia, or China. I cannot see an influence of this concept on the policy of the so-called hard security, which I deal with. Since 2010, and particularly since 2014, Sweden has made its defense policy more realistic. It has been cooperating closely with NATO, with the USA. It has invested in its military capabilities, and to be a bit more critical about the Swedish policy, I think it only partially influences the relations of Sweden with countries where women's rights are limited. I mean, Middle East countries. In my opinion, also to present a critical view here, well, it is also critics in the country. They also indicate what I'm going to say in a moment. Well, Sweden is promoting a feminist foreign policy when it comes to Third World, Middle East, and so on and so forth. But it has issues when it comes to equality of men and women in social aspects, with when it comes to people with migration backgrounds at suburbs of the biggest Swedish cities. And Katarzyna Tubilewicz describes this in a really great way in her book entitled Moralists. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. And now voice over to you. If you have any questions, you can ask them. I mean, the audience. I also have a couple of questions myself. We have some 30 minutes left, but I'd like the audience to be given a possibility to ask questions as well. And I think there are some people who want to ask questions. So voice over to you. I'm going to pass the mic. I have the following question, but please introduce yourself. Just introduce yourself. Anna Ptaszyńska. I have the following question. It is a question to the last speaker, but also to Mr. Ambassador. So you were saying that Sweden, that the influence of Sweden on women's rights in the Middle East, for example, is limited. However, as I see it, women's rights are much more limited in Latin America, for example. And why so? In the Middle East, women's rights are limited from our point of view. However, different rules have been internalized by women who live there. However, these are not internalized in a similar way by women who live in Latin America. So they suffer much more. I mean, the women who live in Latin America suffer much more from how their rights are limited because they have not internalized these limitations, as opposed to the Middle East, where women seem to have internalized these limitations. Thank you, Aneta Ostaszewska. I represent the University of Warsaw. I have some comments. Not really a question. This is just a comment I want to make. I'm very happy that this discussion is taking place. And when I look at the topic of this discussion, I can see that it relates to Sweden in particular, which is not a surprise for me. But I think that we are narrowing the perspective this way. I am very glad that Mr. Ambassador referred to these 3 R's, because this is the fundament of the feminist foreign policy, so representation, rights and resources. However, I do not agree that the feminist foreign policy is something that has just started. I put it differently. The feminist foreign policy may not be a topic which is broadly discussed worldwide or a topic that has been researched well. But it's not because it just started, it's because there is so much ignorance when it comes to this phenomenon. There are so many people in this room, and most of the people who are present here are women. So we can see once again that the recipients of our discussion will be women and not men. And this happens again and again. So this is again the question of representation. So when we are supposed to discuss this perspective, it would be good for the other half of the population to have an interest in following this discussion and just to be present. Also, it's not just Sweden and Canada. Of course, it's good to mention these countries because these were the first countries to introduce this feminist foreign policy. However, there are other countries which are taking some measures in this direction too. And there is something I disagree with. The feminist foreign policy is not the perspective of women who suffer more because of the limitations they need to face. So we just should focus on these three R's. And I think there was someone else who wanted to take the floor. Klementyna Sochanov. I'm a writer, I'm an activist. I'm a feminist activist, and I've been doing research on networks of religious fundamentalists who present themselves as enemies of such concepts as the feminist foreign policy, and they also have some links with the Kremlin. And my question regards Sweden. Is there a tool in Sweden dedicated to counteracting this propaganda of the Kremlin, because there are campaigns against the LGBT, for example. So do you have in Sweden any ideas as to how to fight this propaganda provided by the Kremlin, these information campaigns provided by the Kremlin against the LGBT, for example, or against women's rights? Piotr Kaczyński. I may be quite ignorant, actually. So the feminization of politics, not just foreign politics. Ursula von der Leyen declared that there would be equal representation of men and women in the European Commission. She has not been successful. There are some 40% of women. And it's good that we have more women in politics, but it's already like the second wave, and maybe we do have women, but they do not have the most senior positions. There is a committee, the FAM committee, and there's just one man on this body. And also, this committee is not seen as a leading committee in the European Parliament. It is perceived as something of secondary importance, and also every member of the European Parliament has a limited choice of committees which they can join. So I have this impression that women are kind of forced to join those committees which are not so important. And well, the European Commission was supposed to have so many women. This has not been successful, and I think that there's something that we are missing out. We seem to be focused on the gender of the candidates which are proposed, and we no longer focus on their competences. So could you make a comment regarding my statement? Two more comments from my side. Yes, Ursula von der Leyen said that she would strive for equal representation in the European Commission, but the result is 16 to 11, I think. And she asked all the member states of the European Union to propose two candidates of two different genders. But, for example, the Polish government did not do this. So there were two male candidates. And as regards what Justyna Gotkowska was saying, we can see this role of feminist foreign policy as a sectoral policy, so something which is kind of narrow, focused just on some areas and something that does not have a holistic approach. And this is also something Agnieszka Lichnerowicz was talking about, and I have a question for Agnieszka regarding the US elections. We can see that women are becoming more and more important in US politics. And now the Democratic Party also has a very serious female candidate for the new elections. And from the global perspective, well, we could have a feminist governing the greatest superpower in the world. So how do you see this role of the feminist foreign policy? And one more question from Mr. Ambassador. One more critical remark. When we see Sweden, well, this is a humanitarian superpower or a moral superpower, but at the same time, Sweden is exporting a lot of weapons worldwide. These are, of course, high technologies, so there is a lot of industrialization in Sweden, but how can you reconcile these two values, and what kind of transformation would you need in the Swedish economy for the feminist foreign policy to become a holistic approach and not a vision which is limited just to certain areas? So I think let's keep the same order.
Let me start with what Mr. Ambassador said. Well, I would not like to have a quarrel with anyone. I just wanted to outline my picture. There are different concepts that could be mentioned here. Sweden is a practitioner. Sweden is a country which, in a very open way, conducts this policy, and I totally agree that there are components of this policy present in other states as well, for instance, New Zealand. But it's also about representation and about equality. But there are researchers who take into account and draw the attention to the fact of, for instance, peaceful negotiations in Colombia. When women are present at the table, they have this gender experience. If there are certain areas which are reserved for women and men, if we believe in that, then if we are about to create a new peaceful order, if we have no women, then we do not have the perspective which is more represented. There is no perspective for areas which are more represented by women. Of course, this not all of you might agree with this concept, but there are concepts also which claim that Sweden cannot be a country which conducts feminist foreign policy and at the same time export weapons. Or it is impossible for Canada to talk about feminist foreign policy and have very liberal trade agreements with the rest of the world. That's just a perspective. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. This is just an approach. But in classical terms, this policy has been defined by Sweden using those 3 R's. And there are lots of concepts under this policy, and they may be represented by different people. And I just wanted to depict a picture. Well, Justyna did not say it is a whim. She just said that there are people who claim that feminist foreign policy is a whim or a fad. And when it comes to the question of Piotr Kaczyński, well, presence of women on the one hand, I think it's an emancipation process. First, you need to enter a place As journalists, we often joke that the presence of women is linked to the precarization, because men no longer want to be present in places where there is not much money. And I think that I'm really fascinated by the US from the feminist perspective. And it turns out, and it's been subject to research in the US, there is a question of likability. Is it possible to like Elizabeth Warren? One of the main questions that are asked. Is it possible to like Elizabeth Warren? She's not very likable. She's discouraging leftists with strange ideas. So it's very typical to say epithets about different kinds of people. Elizabeth Warren is just an example here. And there's been a study saying that women, when they enter politics, they are given credibility credit, because at the very onset they are very credible and reliable. But then if they make a mistake, people are much more disappointed with them than they would be with men. And it's probably because of this fact it was so easy for Donald Trump to win with Clinton, irregardless of whether we like Clinton or not, because it was really fascinating how he called her, and he gave some epithets towards her, and it was really fascinating. So it was really interesting to see whether the US would elect a president that does not use the word feminism. And we might talk about liberal feminism, which focuses on, just like Hillary Clinton, on equality in wages, in breaking this glass ceiling. And Elizabeth Warren is much more leftist. Her feminism is also more leftist. He would talk about her experience with being pregnant and losing her job, or living a life where most of household duties have to be performed by women. So I think that Hillary Clinton manifests her feminism in a much more intense way than Elizabeth Warren. And I think this results from the fact that feminism can be more or less liberal. It has lots of different dimensions because people are also different. Thank you.
We'll start with the two questions that I was asked, and then I have a couple of comments also. First, on the question on how we counter Russian propaganda, and I think the question was particularly the Russian propaganda about LGBT. First of all, I don't think we are the target audience for that propaganda. I think the Russian public is the target audience. They use, the propaganda use the perceived situation in this case in Sweden to claim that Russia is better than those countries. So, and also, I would argue that the Russian propaganda on this particular subject doesn't have very big impact in Sweden. How do we counter it? Well, certainly not with propaganda. We are not going to counter propaganda with propaganda. We counter it with free speech, investigative journalism, the fact that the media can do its job, the fact that people are talking about it. I think that we are much better off in countering disinformation now than we were a few years ago when no one talked about it. Now everyone is talking about it. And ideally, it helps us to evaluate more critically what we read in the papers and what we watch on TV in terms of information and news. We should, however, be careful so that we do not end up in the stage where we don't believe anything, because that is, of course, the purpose of the propaganda. Propaganda is not the purpose. Purpose is not to convince us, but to confuse us that we should not believe in anything. And we must be careful not to end up there. But a critically evaluation, a critical approach to what we hear and read, I think is not only useful but necessary in the information landscape in which we live, especially if we get our news through social media, which, as you know, the algorithms which are used by social media ensures us that we get exactly the kind of information that we seek, that confirms our convictions. And that will make us living in each in our small bubbles of information, only getting information that already confirm our preconceived convictions. So the remedy, again, free speech, independent media, investigative journalism, and critical citizens. I think education in school is also important. The fact that we need to ensure that school children from an early age get it installed in them, that they have to evaluate information critically and use their own mind to ascertain that if they seek information, that they should seek it broadly, not only through certain limited sources. The other question, if you can combine the feminist foreign policy with arms export, well, I would argue that you can, and because it is really about two separate things, at least in my view. To have a feminist foreign policy based on the goal that half of the population should have the same rights and influence as the other half of the population does not preclude us to be able to defend ourselves if we are attacked. And it is a fact of life that there are bad people out there who want to do us harm, be them criminals, be them leaders of countries who want to use their position not only to create regimes of terror in their own countries, but also to attack other countries. And we must be able to defend ourselves against that kind of threats. That's hard security, what Justyna was talking about. And it's obvious that we are going to ensure that we have the instruments so that we can defend ourselves. And since we have a defense industry in Sweden, if other countries want to buy their weapons to ensure that they can defend themselves, I don't see any collision with the feminist foreign policy concept. Another thing is that we are, of course, not selling to anyone. There is a legislation where every export deal has to be scrutinized by an especially appointed authority based on the legislation that is in place, and the basic rule that you are not allowed to export unless you can prove that the recipient, the buyer, is acceptable. We are not exporting weapons to North Korea, for example. And I think this is just the way the world looks like. Of course, ideally, the world would be free of weapons and at peace. That is something that we are striving for, but we are not there yet. So I don't see this discrepancy. As Justyna pointed out, we are now investing again in our national defense and territorial defense. We spent a lot of efforts for a long time taking part in international peacekeeping operations. We are still doing that, but we also realize that we have to beef up our own defenses, the defenses of the Swedish territory, because that's the way the situation looks like, unfortunately, in our part of the world. And the current government, which is a feminist government, leads the way in adding to defense expenditure, which just shows what I just said, that you can combine these two concepts and these two objectives. Finally, a point on the fact that the European Commission is not 50-50. No, it isn't. I think it just shows that we are not there yet. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do. The situation in the European Parliament, I'm afraid I don't know the particulars. You are most likely right that it is underrepresentation there of women. But on the other hand, and to take an optimistic view of it, the fact that that is being noted is a step forward, because there was a time when that was not really talked about. No one really paid attention. Now people do pay attention. They count. They talk about it. You take part in this as well by raising this issue. I think that's the way forward, because again, there is no reasonable explanation why it should be like that. I think everyone understands that that's not right. In my own country, we have never had a female prime minister.
We had 3.
You had 3. We have had none. We had female speakers of parliament, but still, we have not had a female prime minister. That's not right. In Swedish industry, if you look at the managing directors and chief executive officers of the companies listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange, there is a devastatingly big majority who are men. That can't be right. But it's being talked about, and it's being discussed, and it's being criticized, and I think now the owners of these companies, they realize that there has to be a change. The argument is then raised that we need to have competent people. Yeah, of course. But if you take the European Commission, it defies logic that it would not be possible among 500 million people to find at least 16 women who would be who would be competent enough, or 15 women, to serve on the European Commission. So that argument does not work, in my view, for the European Commission.
Latin America?
Like
Impact of Swedish foreign policy on women's rights in Latin America?
Yes. Well, I don't have the details, but what we do, and that's what I said initially when it comes to the resources, is to try to spend the money that we allocate for international development. Yeah, Colombia is, but that's for the peace talks. We have made an effort to make women represented in the peace talks in Colombia, also in Mali and Syria. You mentioned that there's research supporting the fact that you get better peace deals with such representation. There are other researchers who say that no, you can't really show that, but I haven't seen any research that says that you get a worse deal if you have women represented. So what we say is that if you have women, you have better representation, you have a wider representation when it comes to the population. Therefore, you should have women included. In Latin America, we do have bilateral development cooperation with in some countries in Latin America, not as many as in the Middle East and in Africa. But I take your point. There most probably are as convincing examples in Latin America as in other places in the world of underrepresentation of women in society, and that they don't have the same rights as men. And again, we are not where we should be, but we are at least working on it.
Jeszcze zanim Justyna odpowie, pozwoliłbym sobie na króciutkie...
Answers her questions, I would like to ask one additional question, which is directed to Mr. Ambassador. I had this impression that Sweden seems to be a perfect partner for both Polish right-wing parties and left-wing parties, because you've got this feminist foreign policy, but at the same time you have the same kind of sensibility when it comes to the defense policy and weapons. So it looks like you can cooperate with both sides. Maybe it's not a question for Mr. Ambassador, it's a question for Justyna now. How do you see this? Would Sweden be like a good partner for Polish politicians, like a good compromise, because both right-wing and left-wing Polish parties could work with Sweden? I think that Sweden is a very important partner for Poland in terms of defense policies, and our defense minister actually declared that Poland would be acquiring submarines from Sweden. And this could be something that initiates some serious cooperation between the Polish army and the Swedish army. Sweden is not part of NATO. However, if there is a war, Sweden will be supporting the NATO and will play a crucial role in the defense system, especially with regard to the Baltic states. So I think that this cooperation should be developed and should be as broad as possible. And I think for our current government, well, for every government we have in Poland, Sweden will be an important partner. But let me answer the other questions that were asked by the audience. I cannot make any comments about Latin America because I'm not following Swedish activities in that region, but I was talking about the Middle East, and this refers also to what Mr. Ambassador was talking about. So this feminist foreign policy has limited scope. A few years ago, a Swedish company wanted to open a weapon factory in Saudi Arabia, and it was a big scandal, and the foreign minister was promoting this feminist foreign policy. And the Swedish society did see this as a problem, that the Swedish company would like to open a weapon factory in that country, in Saudi Arabia. And this Swedish propaganda would be directed to the internal domestic market, but I think also to Europe. And also there is a reason why Sweden is coming back to this holistic concept of total defense, so also in psychological terms. And there were reports drafted for the Ministry of Defense and for the Parliament how to increase this defense policy of Sweden in psychological terms. But of course we need to remember that Sweden needs to do its homework, and the Swedish Democrats, so a quite radical right-wing party, got a significant support during the last elections. It was over 20%. So, in fact, more than the Social Democrats. And this is, of course, something which might be a problem. It is related to migration in Sweden, which is perceived as a problem by the Swedish society. There is violation. There is violence. There are gangs operating in the biggest Swedish cities, and Sweden just needs to do its own homework, so that the Russian propaganda could not be used against Sweden to create like a negative image of Sweden also in the European Union and the US. And Russia might be interested in doing this. And the representation of women in the European Parliament or European Commission, I think it's a good thing that we now have some significant representation of women. Maybe it's not 50-50 yet, but the representation of women is already significant. And I think women should just focus on content-related issues, on being competent, so that no one can say that a woman is represented on a body just because of her gender. And I always bring up this argument that we need more women during panels, discussion panels. However, it is not a good idea just to invite any women, just so that it's 50-50. I just believe there are enough women who can be invited to participate in such a panel discussion. So it's not that you have a 50-50 goal and you need to invite any women you can get. This will be counterproductive. So yes, you should make sure that there are women in the panel. You should make sure that half of the panel are women, but you need to find competent women, not any women. And I think it's absolutely possible to find competent women no matter what the topic of your discussion is. And by doing so, you'll make sure that women will have higher representation in the public discourse. Are there any other questions? We have still 6 minutes, I think. So are there any other questions? There is one question over there. But please ask short questions or make short comments because we need to leave the room soon. Hello, Justyna Gotkowska. I represent the Women's Congress and the Green Party in Poland. And I've come here to learn whether women can save the world. And to be honest, I do not know this yet after having listened to you, and I would like to get an answer to this question. And now a comment. Well, you made a comment that we have so many women in this room and less men. Well, it's because women want to save the world, and that's why they've come today to this discussion. So, any other questions? Oh, that's it? Yeah, that's it. Okay, so can women save the world? We need an answer to this question. Agnieszka Lichnerowicz, you are the first one to go. Well, who else? Who else? It must be women. It is a very simple question, of course, and it is very difficult to answer simple questions in a simple way. I'd like to make 2 points. I think there is common agreement when we are discussing international politics, but let's focus on that. It is a transition period. We used to have structures, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we used to have structures which were based on international agreements. There was a lot of hypocrisy in this, and we wanted to cooperate, and we hoped for this economic cooperation to ensure peace worldwide and human rights, but this was also exploited and abused. Just look at what happened in Iraq, for example, and there are players like Donald Trump who just abuse these concepts, and China does the same. So from this gender perspective, we can say that what Donald Trump suggests, or what China suggests, or what Saudi Arabia suggests, or its leaders, what the Kremlin suggests, this is a policy which is based on interest, on force, on short-term alliances. So this would be like some kind of macho politics. So what would be the answer to this? This gender-based, feminist foreign policy based on international agreement. This would be the alternative. That's the path we should take, and I think if we do so, we stand a better chance to avoid serious problems. And there is a book entitled Force, and I think that it summarizes what this whole concept is about.
Zwoje elektryczne, w wyniku czego mają siłę fizyczną dużą.
It's a sci-fi book where women are equipped with some electric cords which give them power, and it turns out that they start to rule the world in church, in politics, in business, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that the mere fact that they enter the role of leaders does not change the world dramatically. Because, and that's where the title of the book comes from, as long as our world is based on force, those who are more powerful will exploit those who are less powerful. And this should be changed. Where we know that women are more likely to cooperate, they are less egoistic, and so on and so forth. That's the these are stereotypes. So if we want to include gender policy in our politics, this means that we are changing the perspective entirely. Women think differently. Women think about things that are not thought about by men, and this change will probably bring about more stability to the world. And if we believe in this, then we should say that it's only women that can save the world, because in this stereotype approach, we ascribe values and features to women which are quite unique, and there are lots of different concepts, leftist concepts. We might build cooperation on the level of ideas, on the level of associations, on the level of institutions. So ultimately, I'd say yes, women can save the world.
Well, it's going to be much easier to save the world if women are well represented. That's clear. If women have the same rights and influence as men, we are going to have a much easier task of saving the world. Actually, saving the world, my view is that the way to save the world is to have more of multilateral cooperation, harnessing the technological advancements that are being made on an everyday basis. That's how we save the world. In the meantime, we can make the world a better place by more women participation, more influence of women, and more equal societies. Because this also, especially in Europe, this also goes to how we are going to manage on a continent where a larger and larger part of the population is going to get older and older. We need people who work, and then we can't tell half of the workforce that no, you are not going to, you're not supposed to be part of the labor market under the same terms as the other half. We need labor participation of women to a higher degree in general. For that, we need social benefits that makes it possible for families to take care of their children equally, not only women but also men, and so on. There are many things that can and should be done. We are going to make our contribution to this work. I just want to underline that although the former Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, launched the policy, she has now resigned. Our current Foreign Minister, Ann Linde, is continuing that task. And she actually, before she became Foreign Minister, she was Minister of Trade. And she launched the concept of a feminist trade policy, which she is now bringing into the foreign policy area. So we are going to continue to work very hard on this. We are not ready in our own country, as was pointed out. So we have a lot to do in Sweden, but that is not going to make us lose focus and perspective also on how we can contribute to the global arena. We are a small country. We can't change everything, but we are going to continue to say what we think and to argue our case. And if that is going to create controversies, so be it.
No dobrze, to ja znowu w roli krytyka. Ja mam
critical point of view as from my perspective as well. I have doubts whether women will save the world because women, just like men, have different political views. And I totally agree with the previous speakers that more representation of women in political, social, and economic life can contribute to decreasing inequalities. But we still need to remember that we are approaching a certain change in our geopolitical surroundings, and this change requires quite hard politics, international policies, foreign policy, mostly when it comes to security. And we cannot be illusioned that the other party will appreciate the cooperation with us and the fact that we stretched our hands to make peace in the world. Thank you very much. Before I extend my thanks to the panelists, I'd like to make a short comment. There is a social experiment which describes how leadership is created and how social movements are created in this way. There is a meadow full of people, and on this meadow there is one person who starts to dance in a very different way, waving hands and making strange things. And after some time, other people start to follow this person, and it seems that, well, and then next people join them, and we have a snowball effect, so to speak. Everyone seems to feel free. No one makes strange things because everyone makes them. And I think that what Canada, for instance, does is very similar. We've got countries which suggested certain new approach to foreign policy, and automatically they made the first move, and they are most prone to be attacked. They may be accused of being hypocrites and so on and so forth, as it is the case with Canada and Sweden, because there are accusations of hypocrisy, because we have Saudi Arabia, for instance. And in this model of the creation of social movements, the role of the first follower or the first followers is of key importance. So if we want to have a transformation of foreign policy towards a policy that would be based on feminist and not only feminist values, because we said that feminist foreign policy is a broad concept, it is key not to focus on mistakes. Well, we need to be aware of the mistakes, but what we should do is to follow and to choose the path that's based on values and ideals, and we shouldn't laugh at those who make the first step only. Thank you. I'd like to extend my thanks to our great panelists. I'd like to thank the audience for interesting comments and questions. Applause for you.